Our next and final speaker is Dietmar Heinke.
Okay, is that working? Yes, right, okay. So let me thank the organizers for inviting me to this very nice conference. I really very much enjoy this, and it's really nice to walk back to the conference venue this morning and saw the snow on the mountain. It's a very nice, unique setting of this venue. Yes. Oh, and I should also thank the audience for coming to this last talk, especially after the social dinner. Thanks for turning up. And I think probably double thanks in the sense that this is a very unusual talk. So I'm going to show very little data and even fewer experiments, at least with humans. I'm going to show mainly experiments with computers. So this is about computational modeling, right? And so I'm going to look at computational modeling of visual object identification and visual guided reaching movements. So I thought I'm starting out with a few remarks about my computational models, with sort of what the reference points are for this, for my models. So I'm basically interested in what could be called reverse engineering. So I would like to implement computer programs that can do these visual guided reaches or object identification. Right? And I want to do that in a connectionist framework. So this is kind of was devised in the 80s by the PDP group. And you might know they devised actually quite a few different network paradigms. And I've met people who think connectionist networks is mainly backpropagation, which is actually not really true, right? There's a whole variety of different network types that come under the heading of connectionist networks. And the one I'm using, or my networks are closest related to, this interactive activation models. I think it was mainly Rumelhart McClelland who used them. So my networks consist of, mathematically speaking, sort of nonlinear dynamic interactions between neurons. And that's what I think, probably very simplifying, are the essence of brain computations. Another reference point which probably might be useful because they have become more popular recently are these drift diffusion models, right? So you can think, if you're familiar with drift diffusion models, you can think of my neurons basically as a drift diffuser. It's a sort of Brownian motion kind of thing. But different from the drift diffusion models, I have basically several diffusers, several neurons interacting with each other in various different ways. Okay. Oh, yes, I forgot the last point. No learning. So this is where probably quite different from what the PDP group suggests. So my models don't learn. Right? For once, my data, or the behavioral effects I'm interested in, don't concern learning, right? So I don't really see a reason why my models should be able to learn. And the other reason is I want to implement models that can do already quite a few sensible things without really needing learning, right? So that's where my model's also a bit different from the deep learning approaches. But I will talk about deep learning, or will relate my models to deep learning a bit later, in more details. Okay, so that's the sort of framework for my modeling approach. And so my talk is actually organized in two parts, so following on from the title. It's in the first part, I'm talking about the selective attention for identification model, SAME. And in the second part, I will talk about this reaching model that kind of uses mechanisms we learned from SAME, but but basically uses those mechanisms to control reaching. Okay. Okay, to the first part. I should acknowledge the people who've contributed to this same project, in particular Glyn Humphreys. And I should also say that I'm still a bit shocked about his untimely death, a bit like a year ago. Yes, that was quite a loss for the community. And also personally. Anyway, so the starting point of CIMeC is essentially the questions: how do humans identify objects in a scene with multiple objects, right? And obviously, that question in its generality, as you put here, is far too big to answer that within my lifetime, probably. Anyone's lifetime. Anyway, so what we're going to focus on is translation invariant object identification. And, well, okay, I said that already. We're going to do this in a kind of connectionist framework. We also did more sort of simplifications and use more building blocks in the model. We do simple template matching on the object identification stage. To implement translation invariance, we use a mapping approach. So again, that makes the network quite different from the deep learning approach. And to implement the model's ability to deal with spatial selection, with the multiple object situation, we implement something like spatial selection, which could be seen as one of the mechanisms of attention. So that's the architecture of CIMeC. So what you see here are different modules, something called a contents network, selection network, a knowledge network, an inhibition map, and you've got here an input which has sort of simplified to objects, and it has knowledge about those objects. It knows about, in the knowledge network, it knows about triangle, squares, and circles. And it has a focus of attention, so that's our spatial selection. So let me take you through that network step by step and tell you a bit what's happening in these different networks. So that's still quite an overview, and I will go deeper into the mechanisms after I've showed you basically the big story, the big behavior. So the contents network essentially takes the input image and maps a section of that input image into the focus of attention. And so here it has basically captured the triangle, and it can do the mapping in a translation invariant way, meaning basically no matter where that triangle appears in the input image, that triangle can appear in the focus of attention. So that's what I think translation invariance means. Now, the contents network can't do that really on its own. It needs help from the selection network. And the selection network essentially directs the focus of attention of the contents network to a certain location, right? So in this case, in this example, the selection network basically has directed the focus of attention to the triangle, right? Then the knowledge network identifies the content of the focus of attention, right? So in this case, it finds essentially the best matching template unit being the triangle and switches that one on. Now that is a bit of a simplification, as I said that now. Because what really happens is that the knowledge network is, well, everything is kind of temporal, right? So the selection network takes a bit of time to actually produce the full triangle in the focus of attention, right? And also, and the knowledge network already starts thinking about what could be the object that's here appearing in the focus of attention while that sort of selection process is taking place, right? So it's not a sort of serial step, first selection, then identification. These things happen in parallel. And even better, there's something called top-down modulation. So while the knowledge network thinks about what's appearing here, it also starts projecting its finding, as it were, down to the selection network, and directs essentially the selection network's attention to certain parts in the input where there are known objects, right? So these template units are kind of feeding back into the selection network and directed to known objects. Oh, and yes, there's the inhibition map. So once the network has identified an object, it projects an inhibition of return into the selection network. So it basically prevents the selection network from reselecting the selected region. And when the selection process starts again, selection network will look for a different location, a different region to select. Okay. So that's a simulation result. We published a few years ago. So no longer triangle, no longer circles, but in reality, twos and crosses, right? So this is the input image, the visual field, the stimulus, and this is the knowledge that the knowledge network has, the templates, and it knows about the two and the cross, right? So what you see essentially here is that in the focus of attention, after some time, so this is time here, right? The cross appears, and that sort of is matched by the knowledge network switching on the template unit cross here. And then the knowledge network reaches a certain threshold, and the inhibition of return sets in, and it's a brutal reset. It's probably not the best feature of this model. And then the selection process starts again, and this time the two is selected and the two is identified here. Right. Oh, and I've got a movie. So you see that's kind of what I think is happening in the brain, right? So you see here in the FOA the cross appearing after some time, and the timeline here is a bit arbitrary, right? This is not seconds or something, that wouldn't make sense. And then you see, yes, so the cross has here appeared, and then eventually the recognition has taken place here in the knowledge network output, and then the two appears. Right. Okay, let me tell you a bit more how this works, right? So how does that mapping work? How do we go about designing the connections in the network and so on? So the content network, like I said earlier, is supposed to enable translation invariant mapping. So it uses something called the sigma pi unit, something that was introduced in the PDB books in the 80s. And what the sigma pi unit in the contents network does, it receives inputs from two layers, and the two layers, the activation of the units in those two layers are multiplied pairwise, meaning basically this unit is multiplied with this unit is multiplied with that unit, so it's going to spatially corresponding multiplications. And after that pairwise multiplication, the sigma unit sums up the multiplications, right? So what that means essentially is if I have a configuration activation-wise, here, like, I have a layer here that has one unit switched on, right? Has an activation of 1, and the other units are 0. Then what happens is that the activation from that unit appears at the output of the sigma pi unit, right? So if I wanted this activation to appear here, I would switch on that unit, and so forth, right? And you see that essentially, if I set up the right sort of activation here, I can become translation invariant, right? So wherever that red unit is, right, I can appear basically at the output if I choose the configuration here, right? If I choose the right activation. Yeah. So actually what we've got here is the input image and a layer. Okay, the output is the focus of attention. And the layer here on the right is actually part of the selection network. It should have appeared now. Anyway, right? So here, this is actually the selection network, and this is the input image. Right. So for the selection network, there's actually a layer for each unit in the focus of attention, for each unit in the contents network. Right? So if I want an object to appear in the focus of attention, right, what I need to do is I need to switch on units here on the diagonal of this layer, in the selection network. Hope that wasn't too quick of a fast forward, right? So if that object here, in quotes, right, was somewhere here further on the right, in order for it to appear in the focus of attention, the selection network would have to switch on units that are basically here on the diagonal further to the right. Again, that sort of implements the translation invariant mapping, or enables the translation invariant mapping. Right. But given that we've got this architecture now, so that's basically the first stage in CIMeC architecture, right? We have to be a bit careful with the activations, right? So in the selection network, we have to basically ensure that activations here on the diagonal appear, right? So I shouldn't allow activations to appear here on the basically a second activation in the same layer, or a second activation here in the color. So if that was the case, my representation of the object would be mangled, right? So I would have no longer a truthful representation of the world, if you like. Right? And the same goes for instance, a unit here, right? If I do that here, again, I get a mangled representation illustrated here by those color overlays, right? So you get basically the sigma pi unit basically would kind of sum up the activation from this unit and the activation from this unit, and that would lead here to the overlap between those two guys. Similarly here, right? Activation between here and here would be passed on to the output. So what I need to design the network is actually to avoid those sort of configurations. And then we resorted to something called the soft constraint satisfaction approach, right? Which is something, and a paper by Hopfeld and Tank was proposed, solving the traveling salesman problem, I think. So what you can do here is you can essentially list a whole bunch of, with this sort of mechanism, with this sort of mathematical energy function approach, you can list a whole sort of set of constraints a network has to fulfill. And activation patterns in the network that fulfill those sort of constraints lead to a minimal energy value of the whole network. So you define some sort of energy for the whole network, and minima in those energy functions essentially define activation pattern that satisfy certain constraints. And constraints in CIMeC essentially are this theoretical representation of selected items. So that's what I just showed you. So I will basically want to avoid these sort of mangled representations. I also want to have want the knowledge network to activate the best matching template. Right? And I want to actually operate the selection network and the knowledge network in parallel. Right? So everything is sort of chucked into this energy function. And then what you can do, you do a gradient descent to find these minima in this energy function. And what actually then falls out, if you use that sort of Hopfield approach, are connections between the different units in the selection network and the knowledge network. And those units are actually competitive and cooperative interactions, right? And an interaction between that parallel and bottom-up pathway. So perhaps that bit is basically the sort of nerdy bit where me as a more engineering mathematics background gets quite excited, right? But essentially, you don't really need to know those sort of details. What you need to understand is that there's now basically competition between objects and templates implemented, right? So actually, one way of phrasing it, one way of describing CIMeC is actually like a bias competition model. Right? So just to illustrate that, what the connections look like. Oh yes, that's maybe an important bit. So this is the selection network. The selection network controls essentially the FOA, said earlier. And now, after I've did this gradient descent approach, the connections here are inhibitions within a layer and inhibitions between layers, or competition connections. And those connections essentially prevent a second unit to become active. Right? So only one unit is allowed to be active in one layer and only one unit in the column. But to ensure that actually neighboring pixels, neighboring units are mapped into the focus of attention, we have to introduce those diagonal connections between the layers. So essentially, those diagonal layers ensure that pixels that are neighboring are mapped into the focus of attention. Now, the top-down connection can be best probably understood as receptive fields that go across the whole visual field, but being modulated by the templates, right? So the top-down modulation produces essentially visual fields that look a bit like templates. So that's how the knowledge network ensures or directs the selection network to kind of known objects. Okay. Now, I thought, given that the deep learning networks or CNNs are invading essentially neuroscience, I'll do a quick detour and do a quick comparison how my network is sort of different from a CNN. Right. So CNNs are relatively unstructured. they require a massive amount of learning. My network doesn't require that massive amount of learning. It sort of sidesteps the learning. Anyway, so it basically, I designed it that it does already something useful before and it doesn't really need any learning. CNNs have typically feed-forward architecture, whereas my network obviously has these sort of top-down modulation, the feedback connection. It doesn't. CNNs don't really have any selection mechanism like mine has, and CNN don't really implement structural descriptions, right? Like parts and relations between parts. And I kind of say that actually CIMeC does that, right? And that might be a bit surprising because CIMeC just has all these pixels and units. But anyway, so I wanted to just say there's a nice paper by the Tannenbaum group as a project BPS that I think aims to remind the deep learning community that, for instance, things like these structural descriptions or compositionality, as it can be labeled as, actually an important part of the of human information processing, right? And I hope that maybe will make the deep learning community to think a bit more about those sort of more structured approaches. So I just want to explain a bit why I think CIMeC does essentially do part relationship representation. And I thought I'm going to kind of go back to the future, I would hope, and show basically what would happen if CIMeC was merged with Biedermann's recognition by components theory. Right? So that's a sort of thought simulation, if you like. So what Biedermann suggested, also in the 80s, is that objects are represented by geometrical primitives like cylinders, pyramids, cubes, and so on. So he called them geons. So an object is segmented into different geons, and the spatial relationship between those geons is encoded as well. So basically the lamp here, which actually unfortunately only consists of cylinders, so I can't show you more different geon types, but never mind. So they would be sort of split up, the different parts would be split up into different parts, and the spatial relationship between those parts would be encoded according to the RBC theory. So actually, if I was to do that in CIMeC, right, the selection network, oops, it's missing, yeah. The selection network would be the encoder of those different parts, right? So it would basically implement a segmentation and grouping process to form those geons, right? And then the FOA would encode essentially the attributes of those geons in a sort of topological way, in this sort of grid base, which in real CIMeC are these pixels. So, and here I would actually encode the spatial relationships between the geons in a sort of Biedermann-esque way, where he suggested that there's some categorical relationship. The spatial relationship is encoded categorical with like top, bottom, left, right. So that's what CIMeC would look like if someone gave me lots of money and lots of time, right? But for the time being, essentially, the selection network just essentially encodes pixels. So it would have one pixel switched on here, one pixel switched on here, one pixel switched on here, and that would be the way, or that is the way CIMeC essentially encodes spatial relationship between pixels. Okay, so I think that was probably one of the first talks where the outlook was given in the middle of the presentation. Anyway, we can still do interesting stuff with the pixels. with a pixel-based pixel-based SAMe. And here's a list of all the effects we can simulate with this simple architecture. And I'm not going to go through all those different effects, but simulations, but I will give you sort of my best of my favorite results, essentially. God, how am I doing for time? 10, 15 minutes left. I might not be able to show you my Lego robot. No, that would be a pity. Anyway, okay, so let's speed up a bit. So the first result I would like to show you is about visual neglect, right? So at the time, I was actually working with Glenn Humphreys, so there had to be some kind of neuropsychology in the mix. So we looked at simulating a fairly specific type of neglect, the object-based neglect. So if you give a stroke patient, pictures like that, the person would basically copy something like that. Right? So for the big flower, you would see that basically left bits are missing. So it's a classical visual neglect, left visual neglect when someone has a stroke on the right parietal cortex. But interestingly, when this person was asked to show copy those two flowers, right? Again, the left parts of the objects were missing, right? Whereas you would have expected from that sort of copy here that maybe the completely left side is gone because the person just has a general right bias, right? But it seems like the person here has actually a bias that goes along object-based lines, right? That's why this is termed object-based neglect. So the question was basically, can SAMe simulate this effect, right? And so what we did, we basically lesioned the selection network, right? And so what I need to remind you quickly so that you understand essentially why we can do this is just remember that essentially the selection network is made out of these different layers, which are actually in reality two-dimensional layers, as you saw in the Geon illustration. Anyway, so these layers basically encode information in visual field coordinates, right? Whereas between layers, you encode stuff in focus of attention coordinates, right? Because each layer controls essentially a unit in the focus of attention. Right? So if I was to lesion the lower left part of the selection network, and I would lesion it basically the same across the visual field coordinates of SAMe, right? Then the lesion would be the same no matter, in terms of visual field coordinates, no matter where there would be an object in the visual field. But in terms of FOA, right, there would be basically a bias here on the left side. So there would be more lesion here than here. So what we would expect is exactly this kind of object-based neglect as a result of those lesions. And that's what happens, right? So we placed essentially the cross at different locations in the visual field, ran the simulation for each location, and looked at the FOA and found essentially that the left part of the cross was missing, no matter where the cross is. Right? So that's sort of the first part of the jigsaw puzzle. But if I have got two objects, does that still happen? And yes. Right? So you see essentially that here the cross is neglected here on the left part, and that bracket is neglected on the left part. Right? So SAMe has essentially this sort of selection bias to the right, so that eventually left bits of the object go missing. So I must say, when I first saw the empirical evidence, I thought this is never going to work. But after those sort of little lesions, it got quite clear to me how this sort of phenomena could be explained. Anyway, so another neglect effect is basically when you where the neglect effect is reduced by the selection by knowledge about objects. And I think this is actually experiments that are done with non-word experiments. So when a patient has to read non-words, the patient shows more neglect than when there are words. So what we did is we gave basically same knowledge about those two objects, T and I, and sure enough, the participant, the same, neglected the left part. But if I tell same, actually IT is a word, is an object, right? And by introducing a third template, then the top-down modulation essentially overrides the lesion and the whole object. The two parts of the object are selected. So what you find is essentially that the explanation for visual neglect by same is given that it produces an imbalanced selection process, which essentially is the imbalance is in translation invariant coordinates and leads to the sort of neglecting of left parts, and we can simulate objects, the inference object knowledge. Okay, the second example, my second favorite example, is visual search. So in visual search, people ask to look for a certain target object on the screen, hidden amongst other, or combined with other objects. So for instance, here they might be asked to look for the L, which is here, and the reaction time is measured how long people takes to find that L, and the number of items on the screen, the number of letters on the screen is varied. And what you sort of find is often that there's a tendency to increase reaction time with the number of displays. But as you probably know, there are also examples where there's no increase whatsoever, which is then called pop-out. Anyway, so you also probably know that those slopes of those visual search functions can vary, they can have hard tasks and easy tasks. And so that is a hard task where the L is basically here, right? And you find a steeper slope in the search function. So reaction time increases more when more and more items are there. So we wanted to simulate that. We modified, same. We added a feature extraction, which was a Gabor filter. We increased the size of the input image so we can fit in more objects. And importantly, we decided not to have any serial search scan here, right? We wanted to know, essentially, in terms of visual search literature, whether this is a parallel search, whether it's possible to replicate those effects with parallel search, right? So these are simulation results for a present trial. So one thing we did actually, which I should add, so this is here the knowledge network. Because of the modifications and the person who's done the work, the depiction has changed a bit, but in principle the architecture hasn't really changed. So one thing we did here in the knowledge network was we gave the L unit, which was actually the target unit here, the target letter, a small head start, right? So we cued the model to look for L's, right? And in absent trials, the model would sort of override that cue, and the L and the T, and the T unit would actually win the output in the knowledge network. So we run simulations with several types of search tasks, where each time we essentially set the templates to the items right? So we were in the L versus T search, the template would be an L and a T. In the upside down T versus L, the template would be basically an upside down T with an L. We did this queuing, I just tried to explain. We ran different display sizes. We had absent and present tiles, and essentially the reaction times were measured by how long it takes the knowledge network to pass a set threshold, right? So here the threshold might have been something like an 0.85 or something, or 9. No, this is 9, I guess. And how long basically the knowledge network took to reach that threshold, we took a simulation for the reaction times. Yes, and we were able essentially to replicate the findings in a qualitative way. So you see here the search for L's amongst upright T's is essentially fairly shallow, fairly flat compared to the upside down T versus L, where it's quite steep. Right? And you also see, right? So what happens? Okay, we could do that for a number of different searches, lines, vertical versus horizontal lines, and so on. So what happens in CIMeC is essentially, because of that competition in units or inhibition connection between, we find this set size effect, right? So the increase of slope. And because of the similarity between the templates, so essentially recognition is harder in the upside down T version, right? Because there's the overlap between the bars. People are slower, but at the same time, because of the top-down modulation, it's also that effect is compounded by the top-down modulation. Right. So it's basically quite similar to what Duncan and Humphrey's theory on target destructor similarity would suggest. And it also kind of highlights that object identification is an important step in visual search. Often in the literature, this object identification in the search for literature, this kind of object identification is very ignored. So, okay. I can't show you the Lego robot. Okay, never mind. Okay, so we also kind of tested CIMeC basically whether it's able to deal with natural images, right? And we basically CIMeC is able to show to deal with natural images, and I unfortunately can't tell you all those. But let me just do something very quickly. Let me go to the Lego task, to the Lego object, to the Lego model, because I'm quite keen on telling you about that. So we basically had two PhD students in my lab, one computer science, one experimentalist. And so we formed quite a nice team, and we looked at something called choice reaching tasks. And in choice reaching tasks, it's essentially like a visual search task, but rather than asking people to press key buttons, we ask participants to reach for target items on the screen. Right? So they make a reach movement like that towards, in this case, essentially, towards the odd color item, right? So that's actually something that's a design originally by Song Nakayama, I think 2006. We kind of replicated their findings and did some other fancy stuff with it, like we TDCS people. But okay, that goes beyond that sort of talk. And so what you do is you measure essentially the reaching movements during that paradigm. So we basically see here the green ones go to the left bottom reach, the blue to the top, and the red to the right item. And what you see is that actually in quite a few trials, people don't show straight lines, straight reaching trajectories, even though physically that would be possible. Right? There's no obstacle or anything in the way of the participants. Right? So it looks a bit like people sort of first go to what is a destructor in that trial, and then kind of redirect their movements into to the true item. And we basically wanted to build a model to replicate those sort of curved trajectories. We used actually a setup built by, we're using the Lego Mindstorm kit, where we have a we build a horizontal Lego robot that is able to essentially replicate or reproduce the task, for the odd color task, right? So there was a camera here watching the Lego arm, and there's a computer somewhere over here that controls the Lego arm. And that's what a reach would look like. So, and we were able to replicate those curved trajectories, right? So that's a straight line the robot would do, and here's the curved trajectories. So what we had to implement is essentially some sort of leakage, which at least that's my theoretical interpretation of those findings. I think essentially that the attention selection, the target selection, leaks into the motor system, right? And so we had to implement a model where the target selection and the motor control system operate in parallel, right? And not a sort of typical robotics approach where first the target would be selected and then the reach would be executed. And what we went back to, yeah, okay. So we basically used some sort of moving plop mechanism, where essentially the position or the speed of the robot arm would be controlled by a moving activation, right? And that moving activation would be pushed around by the selection process, and this way essentially the curved trajectory would be simulated. Okay, so I'll leave it to the question time. Sorry for the overrun.
Hi. So you do the comparisons with CNNs, right?
Yeah.
And to me it seems like the goal of CNNs is just very different from the goals you're talking about, because CNNs were developed to basically generate labels for complex natural scenes. And you're talking about selecting parts of images, and mostly with binary stimuli. So my question is, do you think CNNs can be adapted, for example, by adding top-down feedback connections to perform these kinds of tasks, or does it really require these more explicit modules that you have in your model? And the other way around, could your model be adapted that it can generate 1,000 object classes for occluded stimuli?
Yeah, that's obviously my preferred version. Yes, I kind of hinted at that, how I wanted to do that when I talked about the Geon part, right? So I would have to equip my model with perceptual grouping effects, right? So like line kind of tracing stuff. I would have to kind of do something like a segmentation process. So there would be quite a lot of steps that have to be added to, but in principle, I think it would be possible. Yeah. I think that's I can't really see how CNNs, because, well, you probably would sort of go backwards to a completely amorph connections in CNN and start introducing structures, which might be not too dissimilar to what I want to go from the other side. Right?
Do you think you could just take a CNN and put your model on top of it? As like a...
Yeah, I mean, maybe in order to go then to sort of semantic categories or something, there might be something here where CNNs can become useful then, yes.
No more questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Right. Okay.
And thanks again. This was the end of the workshop. Thanks to all the speakers and the audience, and see you next year.